All right, I am so pleased to have Farnoosh Torabi joining us on the podcast. She's a financial journalist, the host of the So Money podcast, and the author of a new book, A Healthy State of Panic: Follow Your Fears to Build Wealth, Crush Your Career, and Win at Life. I mean, those are high expectations there, Farnoosh. Win at life.
And you can too. Yeah, it's subtitles. What they gotta make a big promise. It's covers matter. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Book covers matter, and there's a reason why it's a fluorescent financial book. I mean, when was the last time you read a financial book that was neon?
Neon green. I mean, this will capture your attention if you're watching us on YouTube.
I'm not playing around. This is my fourth book. I gotta. This one's got to be the hit. Yeah,
absolutely. But it's the first part of that title, A Healthy State of Panic, that I think leads to some questions. What do you mean healthy state of panic, Farnoosh?
What I mean is that we got to stop being a culture that is demonizing fear, that makes us feel shameful for having fear, and that the impulse necessarily must be that you must fight your fears and deny your fears. Look, I'm terrified right now. I don't know about you. The world's a scary place. And for someone to tell someone to be fearless, the way that fearlessness works, Moshe, is that it doesn't. It doesn't. And I'm a living, breathing example of that. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've run into a lot of dead ends because I tried to ignore my fears. And really what I was doing was I was ignoring what I wanted to protect, what was important to me. And so a healthy state of panic is when you can first stop and recognize, I'm afraid, and that's okay. That's normal. And what if I was to turn to my fear and look at it as a tool? As a lot of our emotions, they show up for a reason. You're sad for a reason. You're happy for a reason. You're fearful for a reason. And this book is my way of saying, when you are afraid, here are some healthy ways to think about that feeling, to face that feeling, to ask it questions. I'm a journalist after all, so this is a little bit more of my nature, but I think we can all do that. I think we can all be a little bit more curious about the reasons that fear might show up in our lives, particularly these high stake moments pertaining to our finances, our careers, our relationships, and have more patience with that feeling and try to figure out maybe what the source of it is, what it is trying to identify as important or risky. Show me someone who is fearless, who claims, who protests, I have no fears. I will show you someone who does not actually know who they are.
Yeah, you talk about fear as an evolutionary thing that, going back to the beginning,
right?
That's basically why our species has survived.
Right. You and I would not be here having this conversation had it not been for the gift of fear. And Dr. Diane Fossey, American primatologist, studied apes and chimpanzees for the better part of her career. And
we actually had the opportunity, by the way, to travel to Rwanda.
What?
Where northern Rwanda, where the mountain gorillas are, where she spent amount of time and is, a huge name there. And actually, it's so interesting. I had not heard of her, and my wife, Alex, watched a film about her many, many years ago, was obsessed with her, and was one of the reasons that led us to travel, follow her footsteps to Rwanda.
She's a hidden figure, and she's discovered so much about evolution. And in one of her studies following these primates, she discovers a subset that is always on the periphery of the tribe. They're always on the periphery. They're a little bit more agitated. They're nervous. They sleep with one eye open. And she's like, what is their purpose? What is the point? And so she removes them. And months later, the entire civilization is obliterated. So what this tells us is that fear is important. It shows up as a survival mechanism. And as we have evolved as humans, so has our relationship with fear. And so while still fear is there for us when we're really fearing danger, like the threat of our lives, it's also there to inform us and help us as we feel threatened in our livelihoods.
So you mentioned, there's a lot to be fearful today, right? We're seeing wars around the world. There's been this ongoing fear of a recession here. The housing market is really rough. The job market is tightening. We've all experienced inflation globally, including here in the U.S. That sort of fear can be, can make it feel like it's impossible to go outside and make big decisions. And we live in a time of social media where we're aware of everything, right? Everything that happens globally, we have access to, which only ratchets up those fears, because we used to be able to live in a little blissful ignorance back in the day, but that's not possible in 2023, 2024.
It's not, but I would say that if you're living in this sort of abstract state of fear, when you're worried about a war or you're worried about a recession, that's legit. And those things are absolutely terrifying and we should be afraid. But what can you do, right?
Right.
The difference between what I can't do anything and I can do something with this fear comes down to distilling that fear and bringing it really into your personal life and figuring out what is it about this state of mind that's really irking me, and how can I help myself in this situation? What will this fear, if it actually comes to fruition, if this recession really happens, what will that actually mean for me? And working out those worst case scenarios. Like if you're afraid of a job loss, don't just sort of live in that what if. Think of what if tomorrow, what if now, make it immediate. This is a small tweak that we have to make in the mindset, that we don't think just what if someday, because you will just spiral. There's no solution there. It's when you personalize it, you make it specific and you make it more immediate to you and what's at stake for you, that you'll be then more compelled to come up with some problem solving solutions. I mean, if you're worried really about losing your job tomorrow, like what if, let's map out that worst case scenario. So are you just going to sit here and continue watching us? I hope. But afterwards, go and look up your company's severance policy. Look up your bank statements, see what's in your actual bank account. How long can you stretch that for? And how is your LinkedIn profile doing? So you start to really think about action steps as opposed to freezing in the moment when you think in these bigger abstracts.
Yeah, you talk in the book about what it means to be constructively afraid versus when your fear is not constructive.
I think being curious is the first way to be constructive with your fears. Curious about where does this fear come from? I talk a lot in the book about figuring out the origin of your fears, because sometimes what makes us afraid today as adults is not just random. It's not just like, I was born with this fear. It might be because of how you were raised, the culture within you were raised, your environment, your influences. Those are important things to identify and analyze, because maybe you have been borrowing other people's fears for no reason and they haven't really been serving you. So now as an adult with agency and power, you have a choice now. Are you going to continue to have this fear stick around and derail you? Or do you want to rewrite that narrative? Do you want to maybe abandon that fear? And here's the thing too, I know a lot of us in our financial world, I get this a lot, where I'm afraid of losing it all. I'm afraid of never having enough. And funny enough, it seems to be a lot of times people who have quite a bit. It's like they have jobs, they have healthy bank accounts, but there is this lingering fear of losing it all. And when we analyze it and we trace the source of that fear, it's not a coincidence. We learn that when they were younger, maybe they did grow up in poverty or scarcity, or their parents did lose their jobs or their homes. So it's human nature. We carry that fear with us into our adulthood. It's who we are today is a byproduct of, how we were raised. But on the one hand, I'll say you might want to thank this fear, because in some ways it brought you to a place of really being vigilant about your finances, but you kind of reached a tipping point. You kind of reached a place of diminishing returns with this fear. And now you have to really be honest with yourself. Do you want to carry this into the next 10 years of your life? Or do you want to thank it and lay it down and face your reality?
Or even carry it to the next generation, right?
Right.
You carry it to your kids. You pass along what you learned as a child. You never fully address it and you never question it. And then you pass it along to your kids. And it can go several generations. And I think there is a fear of money that, has roots in your childhood, right? You experience things. You're modeled in, things are modeled in certain ways. We were talking just before we hit record here. You're the, and you address this in the book, you're the child of immigrants, your first generation. My father came here, was born in Morocco, came here, built his own business as a cabinet maker. But you witness certain things, and certain things were reinforced to me. In my household, like cash was king. You paid for the, you bought a used car with cash. You never leased anything. The stock market is not to be trusted. And And it's so interesting because like I even find myself as an adult having this fear of losing it all with, as a, like I'm an immigrant, building my own business, not sure where my next check is going to come from. And that's not an issue. And yet that fear continues to exist in my own mindset. And it's actually, I have found at times stopped me or delayed certain things as I, build Mo News because of this fear, because of things that I can't even quite put my finger on. But I know that between the ages of 5 and 18, it became ingrained.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting and it's ironic, right? Because we were talking earlier about how our parents, all immigrants, they come to a new country and my goodness, they took such huge risks. I mean, my parents left Iran during the revolution in the late 70s. And so they know very well what it means to live a fragile life. And they come here not knowing anybody and I can't believe they did this, right? And then yet they come here and they're like, we're not taking any more chances. You're not allowed to go on any sleepovers. You can't leave the house after 7 p.m. You can date when you're married, my mother used to say. And you must go to college and not even that, go to graduate school, because that's really the marker of success. And you got to work a 9 to 5 and just save. And this idea of being an entrepreneur, of investing, of even, I've written my previous book was about being the breadwinner in my marriage. That too was also very like foreign to my parents and terrifying, because how could it be that a woman would make more than her husband? So I get it. I think that, we carry these ancestral fears into our current lives, but it takes just that recognition of like, oh my gosh, there's a historical pattern here, and this doesn't have to be always the truth for me. And sometimes fear gets exacerbated because there is a lack of knowledge, of context. And so if you find yourself in a place of fear that is just not really you, and yet you can't escape it, maybe that the next healthy move is to get help, is to find resources, is to get more perspective, or even to go back to your family members and get some of that clarity and that context so you can understand where their fears are coming from, and then just put that to rest and say, okay, I get it. It wasn't irrational maybe at that time for them, but today I do have more resources and I have more support systems. I don't need to condition myself the same way that they did.
So in the book, you lay out, I believe it's 9 different fears, right? And so there's fear of money, fear of failure, fear of losing freedom, fear of uncertainty, and you address each one. Is there one above the rest that you think plagues the most amount of people or is most significant? If you were to rank them?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think the first 2 in the book, the fear of loneliness and the fear of rejection. And the reason I think these 2 are are the heaviest and the most prevalent is because they start young. And we have a lot of experience with this, and they're really hard to shake. And loneliness and rejection are kind of close cousins of one another. We fear rejection because of the loneliness, because we fear the loneliness. So it was important for me to address those 2 right away. And I've personally experienced these 2. And again, as young as 4 or 5 years old, growing up in Worcester, Massachusetts, the daughter of immigrants. I didn't speak English until I was about 3, 4 years old. And my parents were terrified of everything. It was the 80s, 5 o'clock news telling you, make sure.
If only they knew. Those were the good old days.
Right. I mean, relatively. So
yeah,
I think that now we know so much more about our states of mind when we're lonely and we're feeling rejected. Again, it's just so hard to shake off. I think because of social media too, that has really added a new layer to reconciling with these really deep-rooted emotions. Like if you're feeling rejection, you can in some ways protect yourself against that, in some ways not, because you go online and I was just reading yesterday on my feed, a mom hadn't been invited to a hangout that she thought she was invited to, but then saw on social media all the moms hanging out without her, and it gutted her and it took her back to high school.
Yeah.
And so I think these are the 2 fears that they're universal and yet also so personal. And we think even as adults, we have so much agency and power over it. And to some extent we do, but it's a work in progress.
So fear of rejection and loneliness, I mean, it's pretty obvious how they manifest themselves in personal relationships, friends, family, romantic partners, etc. How do they manifest when it comes to your financial well-being and also professionally?
I can give an example. I experienced the fear of rejection in my financial life as I was in my 20s and really wanting for extraordinary success. I wanted to be financially independent. I wanted to run a business. And I think for someone who, even like, especially me, who's again, the daughter of Iranian immigrants, where this wasn't the narrative necessarily growing up, there was an expectation that you'll get educated and that you will be quote unquote successful, but in a more traditional way. And I think generally speaking in our culture at large, women, we're not allowed to want for anything, especially to say, I want to be rich. And I think that was really, something I had to really reckon with in my 20s. Like, how much do I share about myself on dates or with others? Because I was afraid of side eye or being excluded or people not understanding me. People thinking I should just be happy for what I have. And even in my culture, like, isn't she just she's pushing the envelope too much? Or, I would hear things like, you should just be happy with what you have. And so I'm hearing all this, and yet I know that because I experienced watching my mother not have financial independence as a wife in their marriage, that there are severe consequences. And so it's like, on the other hand, I was like, don't you know who I am? Like, how else could I be? I'm this person who witnessed so much financial struggle. And now, luckily, I've come up with this solution. The solution is I'm going to take care of myself and be, and shoot for the stars. And what I realized is that with all sorts of fearing rejection, we fear the rejection because today the pain is a lot. We don't want to fear the rejection from our peers and, oh my gosh, maybe I won't find the one because I'm too much. And then I thought, what if I defer to this fear and just play small and be quiet and maybe give up on some of these hopes and dreams? Maybe that'll win me some acceptance today, but where will that leave me in the future? And when I looked ahead, Moshe, I was terrified. I was like, I'm going to become someone that I don't recognize, who is not me, and who is ultimately not happy. So sometimes when you fear rejection today, the trick is to kind of think about if you allow this fear to wash over you, and if you react to it in such a way where you're just trying to be accepted, the irony is that you're just rejecting yourself the entire way. And you're going to end up in a place where you become the shell of a person that you wanted to be. And that, I think, is more scary. And let that be the fear that motivates you today to push harder. And by the way, for every rejection you receive, rejections are louder than the applause sometimes. I think life in our lives, we obsess over the rejection. We forget that we have all these people over here championing us and supporting us. And so I remember I had this one boss, and this was during the early days of digital journalism. And I would write an article, and then immediately there would be comments, and there would be a lot of negative comments. And he'd say, look, people love to complain and reject loudly online. For every one rejection or one sly comment you have, there are hundreds of people who loved what you wrote, who appreciate it, but didn't say anything because it just, that's human nature. It's like, how often do you go on Yelp to write a bad review versus a good review? That's sort of human nature. So on the receiving end of that, just know that that's sort of how the world works, but it doesn't mean that what you're doing is unimportant and that there isn't a place where you can go to be loved. And that's it.
Farnoosh, it's so difficult, though. I mean, like, I sit here as a couple years into doing news on social media, and for some reason, I think it's so natural. Like, I get dozens, hundreds of messages like, "Thank you for the impact that you have. Thank you for covering this story. Thank you for X, Y, Z." And then somebody will be like, "You're an idiot.
Yeah.
Like, you suck. I'm unfollowing you. You're biased. You're this." And then I'll come home. My wife will be like, you've been reading your comments, right? You've been in your DMs. I'm like, yeah. She's like, are you fighting with someone? I'm like, yeah.
No.
She's like, how many compliments have you gotten today? I was like, I don't know, like a whole bunch. But like, this person is such a schmuck. And like, and they're like, and I'm upset. You know, you get obsessed with the rejection.
It is. It's, you know, it's primal too. It's so primitive that rejection during the the Paleolithic era was like literally survival, right? It's like if you got kicked out of the tribe, like good luck. That woolly mammoth is totally eating you. And so we have carried those instincts into the modern times. And so, I mean, I love that you shared that. It's great to hear from other people this empathy around all of these fears that we have. I remember my daughter, she's 6 now, but when last year she fell off the jungle gym in the playground and got scratched up on her face and did not want to go to school the next morning for fear of rejection from her peers. And I understood it. And I, you know, like I could have kept her at home and just to please her for one day. But I said, you know, that's not the healthy fear. What you want to do is when we feel fear, go find help. So I want you to go to school this morning and tell your teacher exactly how you're feeling. And when she did, her teacher asked her, would it be okay if we shared it with the classroom? And they did. And what ensued was, again, this circle of empathy, kids raising their hands and saying, I had the same experience, or I didn't want to come to school this morning either. And they were hugging. And I mean, that's kindergarten. So we can learn this. I think we just have to be guided better because our culture demonizes fear. And when we feel it, we feel immediately small, as opposed to feeling like, oh, maybe this is my calling, an opportunity to fill a void, get help, trace its root, learn more about myself and learn what I want to protect so I can still go do the thing, still go to school, still go to work, show up in life, do the thing that's presenting as scary, but still do it anyway and know that I'm doing it with integrity.
Let's talk about fear of money. Because that, you know, you've covered this world for a long time. A lot of people have abstract fears. Explain what you mean by fear of money, how that manifests itself, and how people need to overcome it.
Unlike a lot of the other chapters in the book that focus on states of mind and fears of like loneliness and rejection and failure and uncertainty, money is, what is it? You know, it's like I opened that chapter with like, what are we even afraid of here? It's just this tool. It's not even, we don't even hold it in our hands anymore. It's completely digital. And so often when I say we're afraid of money, it's more than that. It's really the relationship and the understanding that we have of money, that there is friction, there is fear, there is anxiety. And again, it goes back to, in most cases, how we were raised, the stories we were told about money and our place in the financial world. So I know for minorities and women of color, basically anyone who's not a white man born here, let's say, it has felt for a lot of us like this is just not our domain. You know, we have not been groomed to feel like part of the money world and that we should have a stake in the financial world. So that can brew a lot of fear because, again, fear loves to live in a place of illiteracy and lack of confidence. So when you feel a fear around money, whether it's a fear of losing it, a fear of talking about money with a partner, a fear of investing, there may be an aspect to that fear that deserves tracing again back to its root and figuring out, how did I learn this fear? Is it legit? The other thing I want to say about the fear of money is that sometimes we're not fearing the right thing. You know, I remember being in college and I was afraid of not making enough money to send myself to a study abroad experience. My parents said, sure, you can go to Paris, but it's on you. So I worked 3 jobs one year. I worked all summer. And I remember checking my bank account towards the end of the summer. At this point, I'm thinking I should have thousands in the bank. I had negative dollars in the bank. I mean, what had happened was, I guess over the course of a few days, I had run the debit card to the bone, and I just kept getting overdraft fees. I was using at the time ATM receipts as my financial advisor. That is not, it was the late 90s. So I realized that while I was afraid of not having enough money, And that's a legitimate fear. And like, as a result, I just became a hustler. I just worked and worked and worked. But there was another fear that I should have been in touch with, which was the fear of not managing my money well, the fear of overspending. And so I think fear is just a constant teacher. I think that, in some ways, and sometimes I don't regret working all those hours and making all that money, but I should have also been worried about and fearful of, what if I lose this money? What if I don't track it? And that was a very good early on lesson for me. And my mother also, when she dropped me off at Penn State, she said, if you ever fall into credit card debt, we will not help you. Instilling the fear of God in her 18-year-old daughter worked like a charm, by the way. I did get into some credit card debt, but I had to figure it out on my own.
Well, I was going to ask, was that healthy? Was that message healthy for a parent to give a child?
Sometimes I think you put down the fear gauntlet. And I mean, I'm my mother's daughter, so I kind of knew, like, really, she's not going to not help me. But I don't want to have that conversation with her. It's not going to go great.
As far as practical things people can do, I mean, we've been talking sort of, kind of conceptually about these fears, especially when it comes to money and budgeting and some of the practical steps that one needs to take. We are at the end of the year here. People like to make New Year's resolutions into 2024. When it comes to finances, especially against the backdrop of inflation and a potential recession that we've been waiting for a couple of years that may or may not come, and all the various things that are going on out there as things have gotten more expensive. What are some practical things people should think about doing once they've embraced the fear of money, understand that they have it? Like, what's step 2, if you will?
So fill any knowledge gaps that would help you make better decisions in the new year. I think December is actually a great month because things are a little bit quieter than definitely January. So you have an opportunity now to kind of sit with your finances and review not just your money, but also your lifestyle patterns as they may be changing in the new year. If you have a family and maybe your kids are getting older or changing schools or you're switching jobs, how is that going to change your schedule, which will then inform the way that you work, which would then inform the way that you make money and also your expenses. So getting really clear on kind of, and not to overwhelm you and say, think about all 12 months of 2024, but even just the first quarter, the first 3 months of the year. What is your work-life balance going to look like? What are going to be your financial needs for your household that may be different than what you're accustomed to now? And start turning off some of those expenses in December. So looking ahead to 2024, I realized I don't think I need a bookkeeper anymore because I've gotten a pretty good handle of QuickBooks myself. And I don't need another person to reconcile my expenses. It takes me 5 minutes. I've also looked at other kinds of cell phone plans for my husband and I because I'm embarrassed to say we are not on a family plan, but for all various reasons, because he had a work phone for a while. And so, but now I'm like, this is kind of silly. Like, we should just do this because this is not requiring any differences for us. It's just choosing a different plan, which can save you $60 a month or so. So looking at how you can be smarter with your money in the new year now, and then getting those automations in place or getting those phone calls made to make those switches in December before January kicks off, because you want to hit the ground a little bit like you feel like you're running in January, not that you're just trying to figure out what your goals are. And speaking of goals, now is also a good time to figure out what are some, vacation plans that we might have in the new year? What are some housing changes that we want or employment changes that we're looking at? Do I want to start the business? Do I want to switch jobs? You can't do it all in December, but you can definitely start looking at what's possible and updating your LinkedIn. And again, maybe December does feel like an exit month where nobody's around, but people are. And I know for us, like, we're not going on vacation the last week of December. And it turns out a lot of our neighbors aren't either. And so I think it's a great time to reconnect and take inventory of your habits from the past year and what you want to carry into the new year and what you don't.
I'll ask a personal question. Do you see a therapist? Because I feel like this book is partially, professional advice, financial advice, but part of this is really kind of very much gets into your psyche, and it feels at time like I can't just talk to myself about this. Sometimes you do need to talk to somebody else.
I have not worked with a clinical therapist in my life, but I love therapy. I think therapy is fantastic, and members of my family see therapists. And I did work with a writing coach while writing this book, who was sort of a de facto therapist for me. Listen, it took 3 years to write this book, but it really is the culmination of my 40 years living life oddly afraid and somehow getting things done. And I've written in this book about my family members, and it was very hard to revisit some of these experiences, but I'm thankful that I did have the 3 years. And, the book came out in October, but I, up until August, was rewriting some stuff because, I think the more time you have to process, and especially when you're writing about loved ones, you want to be really careful with how you're presenting them and, your memories versus how they remember things. And I was really worried about my mom's, you know, feedback and reaction. And she was actually in my house when the books arrived for the first time. And so she's reading it, and she was in tears and also laughing. And she said, I didn't realize you were paying so much attention to me.
Wait, did you give them a heads up?
Yes,
or
they
did
knew.
you? Okay,
They
knew
knew
what was coming,
and they were I think, afraid. But they trusted me. This isn't my first book, and I am at the, my first profession is writing, so I take it very seriously. But also, I wanted to be deeply honest and personal. So my father, who's the physicist and very numbers oriented, and like kind of a numerologist, honestly, he's reading it and he says, Farnoosh, there's a problem in your book. And I said, oh my God, he's read chapter 6, because that's not he's in there, and it's not the best for him. And I was like, I'm ready for it. And he goes, your indexing is all wrong. Well, there was one indexing that was off, and it was about him, because I think he went to the index first, of course, because he's who he is. And he looked up Torabi Adam and found page 46 was actually page 45. So
wow, his publisher could your publisher could use your father. It appears.
Totally. That actually would be a great retirement gig for him. He would love it.
One thing you mentioned earlier, we talked about briefly, was social media. And curious as to the impact that, being aware first of all, social media is only a place where you read good things and see pictures of amazing things that your friends and family are doing. And there's, little to no negativity for the most part. Though I think that's changing among Gen Z, but among the millennial set and older, it's like, look at, my beautiful kids, and look at my beautiful life, and look at my beautiful vacation. How does that all factor in here? Because that didn't exist more than 10 years ago.
Well, that's all in chapter 4 on chapter 3, the fear of missing out, FOMO, which is not a brand new fear. I mean, I think that the cave people probably dealt with some of that, feeling left out, missing out, the cave party down the street or whatever. But especially in this century and today, when we have social media and we can see everybody's whereabouts and what everyone's doing, we measure our sense of living it upness to other people's, and everyone's going to Greece, and everyone's, having these gender reveal parties or whatever. And I think it can be, you got to create a boundary.
Everyone went to Greece. At some point, everyone was in Italy. Everyone was in Greece.
What's it going to be in 2024? What do we think?
I don't know what's left. I mean, Portugal was kind of hot among some people. A few years ago, it was Iceland. That's a good question. But it's also the case now where, and we're totally taking a left turn here, that, things have gotten so expensive in Europe. I feel like, I was hearing that the Nordic countries have become the new place to go because the Mediterranean is so hot.
Yeah,
literally.
Maybe Finland,
Perhaps.
Sign me up. I think that you're right. FOMO is a byproduct today of so much of what we're seeing on social media, and you have to create boundaries for yourself. I've started to mute some accounts that I just felt like weren't inspiring me to do great things or feel good about myself. But
you didn't want to bring yourself to unfollow them, just muting them.
No, just muting them.
Got it.
I think you should protect your boundaries online and offline, but especially online. It can be just this really unhealthy rabbit hole. You get on there at 11 p.m. Suddenly you've bought things that you didn't know you needed, and you're wanting for things that you didn't even know you wanted for because somebody else is doing it. And by the way, someone said it to me perfectly. They said social media is a performance. Everybody is performing. That's not to say that they're lying, but they are putting they're performing for you. Like I have definitely lip synced and danced, but there's also like just the performance of the filters and the music. It's like entertainment. So imagine you're watching social media as you are watching a commercial on television. These are real people. These are real products. These are real scenarios, but they are there to try to sell you something in most cases, whether it's another follow, a like, or an actual product.
Right. They also have messy closets. They also have messy personal lives.
Totally.
They also are dealing, you haven't seen their bank statements. You have no idea. You haven't seen their credit card bills.
Or maybe you have seen their bank statements. That terrifies me. People who are go online and they think that the key to winning your approval online is to just share everything, because we live in this world where we honor and value like transparency and vulnerability. It's like, but I don't want to see your Charles Schwab account. That is not safe, actually.
No, and that does lead me to the following. It's a frustration. So as an entrepreneur, making my way, there's a whole school of them that are like, well, I got to a 7-figure business within X amount of time. These people who share their income and share all these details as they're gloating, and then you're like, well, that can't be real. But also, why am I not making that amount of money? Why is that taking me so long? Why did it only take them 2 years? I mean, I see it not only in personal lives, but I see it in the professional space as well.
It's my biggest pet peeve. Actually, I want someone to do an article on that, like an investigation, like looking at all these people who gloat and say, I made 7 figures. But I know people who make that 7 figures, but the expenses that they have to incur to get to that point, that revenue, you may as well just be a mid-level accountant or a teacher.
Right. Like, you're like ultimately after taxes, your profit was 75 grand.
Yes.
50 grand. Yeah.
But it's splashy. It's a headline. And by the way, these things make the news because they are outliers. We don't report on the normal stuff in the news. Like that would not fly. So when you see headlines of these kinds of things,
George Smith increases income this year from $110,000 to $117,000 is not a headline you've ever read in the newspaper. No.
And maybe he does have 80,000 in the bank, because it doesn't matter how much you make sometimes, right? It's what you keep and what you earn. And I have actually did a recent post about this, about how I like to work independently. I have flirted with this idea of like scaling and getting a team in place. And for me, that is what's harder than doing some things myself. And maybe that means leaving some money on the table, but I'm able to then instead earn back my time and not have to worry about other people's financial livelihoods. And, it's a lot. If you care about people, it's really hard to lead, because you want to make sure that, everyone's okay, and that it's hard enough to make sure I'm okay and my family's okay. And then also a team. For me, again, this is obviously just personal, but I think you have to come to a point where you know what's enough, and all this other stuff out there is just headlines for the sake of headlines,
Yeah, though it does take a lot of work to be able to separate yourself from that and not get caught up in the rat race.
So there's a story about this in my book where I was at one point, I had FOMO around all these influencers in my space who were creating digital courses, and again with their 7-figure launches. And I was like, I know things. I follow
a few of those accounts.
Yeah, I have a lot to teach. I have expertise. Am I just leaving money on the table? So I started to pursue this, thinking that I had to. Otherwise, am I even a legit financial expert if I can't put out a stupid course? And so I looked into it, and I was like, oh my God, this is not sparking joy for me to sit behind a computer and A/B test emails and, create all this copy and funnels and then marketing experts and then Facebook ads. And I was like, this is not what I got into journalism or advice giving even for. So I actually remember having lunch with somebody who was a course provider, 7 figures. And he was like, please don't do it. It's so exhausting. It's such a rat race. And what I realized is that my FOMO wasn't completely false. I did want to make more money. I did want to have more control over creating a product that went direct to consumer, because so much of my career up
Right.
until that point
Right. And
was
then and who doesn't want passive income, right?
right, but it's not really
Yeah.
passive. But I said,
No.
okay, what are the ingredients? The FOMO led me to take inventory of what are some of the ingredients that would be important to me in this next career pursuit. What is it? I still want to teach. I want to go to my consumers. I want to make more money. But I realized it wasn't a scalable course. It was an intimate workshop in person, because that's actually leveraging my skill set. I'm better in person. I was in New York too, so I had the advantage of creating a really fun event there, having access to New York City and all these great venues. And I was able to charge much more than a course, because I was limiting the experience to just 10 people as opposed to everybody. And you're going to get more access with that investment to me and everybody who was attending the program in person. And I think people were also it was at a time when people were just exhausted from the whole online digital experience of things and wanted to be IRL. And that worked for me, and it has continued to work for me. So I don't discredit FOMO, but I was able to sort of look at it more honestly and go, okay, it's not about copy pasting someone else's grease or online course or whatever, but it's about, what is it about that experience that I want to experience too, and do it my way.
Your parents came here from Iran, but you've grown up here. Uh, as I to the extent that you can look globally, I know that here in America we do get a bad rap for how much the workaholic nature of what we do, right? The race for money, the race for this. There's opportunities in America that you don't have in many countries, but also our unhealthy relationship with work versus family, work versus relaxation time, etc. To what extent, through your travels, through your research, through the reporting that you've done, what are the pluses and minuses of America when it comes to these spheres, these various spheres, and where we do well and where we grade very low, and how we deal with them versus some of our friends across the two oceans?
I think it comes down to me is this individualistic approach to everything. We come here, and on the plus side, a lot of things are possible for us here that are not possible in other countries. And the ones I know best are like Iran, because my parents came from there. And I mean, I was born here. Thankfully, it wasn't the plan, and we were actually supposed to move back to Iran, but things as conditions there got more dire, and my father had an opportunity to stay here. We took it. They took it, and I'm so grateful for that. But this idea that you can just come here and kind of start over, and you have definitely more privileges and freedoms, but the onus is on you. You have to make those opportunities happen for yourself. And so I think that's where a lot of the hustle mentality and culture comes in, the sleepless nights, the feeling like, we even have cities that pride themselves on, like, as we're the city that never sleeps. It's like, okay. Whereas I really think that it's a diminishing return. You can't keep going like that. It's not sustainable.
Work hard, play hard.
You can't. It's not sustainable. You're going to hit a wall. You're going to burn out. And I think along the way, it's important to know that while there is this incredible opportunity to create something for yourself by yourself, that it should not be the expectation that you have to go it alone, or that it's healthy to go it alone. And I think it's also putting systems and leadership, it's making them unaccountable to the things that we really need, the infrastructures that we really need. I just did a podcast interview with Danielle Weisberg, who's the co-founder of The Skim, and obviously phenomenal, exploding media platform for women, but they're also doing a lot of important work around policy and shaping policy. And one of the campaigns they have is encouraging employers to disclose what their family policies are and their family work flex policies are, really to encourage their peers in their spaces to follow suit or come up with some more creative solutions for their employees as they are trying to balance family and the home life and then the work life. Because really it's on us to even bring that conversation to our employers. And a lot of times we're afraid to do that. So I think when you're fearing speaking up and asking for help, it's probably a sign that you really need to do it, and that you're best to work in numbers to really create a campaign around it and find others who will support you in that, and that you're not alone. Everyone is burnt out, and it is, I think, unfortunately, a byproduct of the culture that we live in that rewards financial gain over pretty much everything else. We live in a capitalist world. So we get a lot of bad messages around what it means to be successful. And, sometimes we learn the hard way. But I think increasingly, thanks to you, we're having these conversations around what it really takes and what's really valuable and important. Health is wealth. And this isn't something we were saying 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I wanted your diagnosis, or I guess your assessment of where we are as a society, because some of the conversations, the hustle culture, et cetera, even though we saw, not so long ago in the 2000s, et cetera, how are we doing, generally speaking, when it comes to starting to address some of the fears that you lay out in your book?
Well, from a institutional policy level, I don't think anything. I think that it's really happening at the cultural level. And even in researching my book, I was reading other books that were offering the same sort of notion of these negative feelings that we've had, whether it's about, Daniel Pink wrote a book called The Power of Regret. We're this culture that's like, no regrets ever. And it's like, he's like, but there's actually a lot to learn from regret. Can we accept that? And then there's the upside of stress, right? So it's like, stress is not something that we want for, but when you have it, is there a way to kind of learn more about yourself and your habits and make healthy choices from that? And so I think culturally we're seeing this shift, and at least in the conversations we're having, in the research that we're doing. Even in the year that I wrote my book, this year, there was a study that came out across multiple academic institutions looking at people who, in one cohort, people who look at emotions like fear and sadness and anxiety as bad. And then those who go, okay, neutral, or maybe there's an opportunity here to grow. The people over here who look at these sort of negative emotions as neutral or potentially helpful are happier. And I think it's just what it's teaching us is that when we are more in touch with our feelings, we're stronger, we're more informed. And this is the sort of stuff that I don't think was discussed, at least not when I was growing up. It was always like, don't cry, don't be sad, always be happy. We're tired of that because it's not working.
There are people who have it worse than you. Appreciate what you have.
Oh, yeah.
Don't complain. Yeah.
Especially as an immigrant, the daughter of immigrants, it's like, I hear this echoed so much. It's just like, what do I have to be complaining about? My parents came here with far less. I have to carry the torch. It's a lot of pressure. And on the one hand, I'm so grateful for that pressure because it has made me persevere and strive for things. But I think you have to balance that with, making sure you're taking care of yourself along the way. And there should be no shame in that. Like, stopping to rest is not pitiful.
Yeah. I found those lessons manifesting themselves also in the relationships that I had, because I would tell, my wife, like, oh, come on, like initially, and we've addressed this, she's addressed it with me, I was like, oh, come on, like, so many people in the world have it, so much worse. Like, why are we complaining about this? Like, let's just move on.
Well, and she's like, can be true. Yeah. What did she say?
Well, she's like, don't deny my reality. Like, This is something I'm upset about, right? Like, this is something that hurts me. And like, sure, all those things you laid out, those people have it far worse than us. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily make me feel better. And again, sort of to the lessons of childhood, you find yourself repeating the various mantras that were ingrained in you. And actually, I had a unique opportunity to go back to where my dad grew up in Morocco. Like where there were like 40 of them living in like 4 rooms. Like, I was like, oh, where do you cook your food? He's like, cook our food. Like, we didn't have a stove. You had to go down the street and stand in line for the community kitchen to cook your food, etc. I was like, what about a dentist? And he's like, a dentist? I didn't meet a dentist till I was 18 years old. We didn't have dentists. Right. There's a guy with a,
and I went to the dentist walking backwards in the snow up 10 feet. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you realize that, like, oh, now I see it. Like, now I understand that, like, me complaining about XYZ, not having the new, not being able to, as all my friends were wearing Air Jordans, not being able to get those shoes or whatever. Like, and my father's like, what are you're complaining about that? Like,
Yeah.
let me
That's
tell
not
you
a
about how I
survival.
had it.
Yeah. You don't
Yeah.
need an Air Jordan versus cooked food. Yeah.
Yes.
We have this tendency to feel as though we cannot suffer or feel pain as long as there's somebody else suffering more pain than us. Like it's like, talk about comparison culture. It even comes down to how we're allowing ourselves to feel, which is, and I even hear this from a therapist on my show, and she recalls when she was helping clients, right? And she didn't want her grief to be known, and she was suffering from two immense losses in her life, back to back in her mid-20s at the time when she was beginning her practice. And she felt like if that was shared or someone found out that she was grieving behind the scenes, that her work as a therapist wouldn't be taken seriously. Because, if she's not well, how can she be helping others? So we have a lot to work on in this area of being transparent about how we feel, and knowing that two truths can live in the same space, and in ourselves. Like, you can be grieving a war that's happening and also recognize that you're having a bad day.
Once you finish the book, you've read about fear of rejection, fear of loneliness, FOMO, fear of exposure, fear of uncertainty, fear of money, fear of failure, fear of endings, fear of you losing your freedom. It's a lot. There's a lot there. That can seem overwhelming, Farnoosh. When people finish your book, what would you like people to take away from it? And does it come with a workbook to then work through all these things?
Oh my gosh.
Step 2.0, your courses that we discussed earlier.
For a while there was a free video series that I was giving to those who ordered the book early. That was took the chapter on money and created kind of a workbook and all that. So I might bring that back. It is a lot, but I want people to know that when they come to this material, that they're going to feel seen, and it's not your typical book about a negative emotion where you're going to be like, oh, this is going to be work. And I want you to come for the advice, but stay for the stories. There is an arc. There is true narrative. You're going to meet characters. You're going to see yourself. It was very important to me to make sure that I represented a lot of different types of people and experiences and opinions, because this book is mine, but it's also, again, it's a reflection of everything that has influenced me over the last 40 plus years, which has been, I'm very grateful to say, just a wide cast of experiences and meeting people from all over. And so thank you to everybody who's influenced me. You're in this book. And I think the best compliment I've gotten so far is that, this book is, again, a book where I saw myself, and I feel like I got permission that I didn't know I needed, to feel okay with my fears, and to know that fear can be just another amazing tool in my arsenal.
Farnoosh, appreciate you coming on, discussing it. Appreciate the book. For those of you, heading out this holiday season, definitely make this part of your beach read or wherever you go on vacation during the holiday season. Would love to have you back at some point for your next book, Farnoosh.
Thank you so much, Mosh. And by the way, if you're going to Greece, make sure you're posting those pictures, right? Because did you go to Greece? If you don't put it on social media, did you even go to Greece? Like, it's
at one point, I believe there was a point this summer where there was no one left in America except for me and you, because everyone else had left.
If the Bureau of Tourism would like to send us to Greece, we are on it. We are on the next plane. Yeah.
Yeah. The Greeks are going to call. They're like, you're giving us a bad rap. Let me tell you what Greece can teach you about your fears. Anyway, Farnoosh, thank you.
Thank you so much.